As Patrick was saying, my name's Sabrina. I'm an epidemiologist by training, so not my work isn't exclusively birds, but more wildlife diseases and the transmission between wildlife, but also humans to wildlife. And so today I'm going to be talking about a mortality event dating back in 2021. So it was localized, started off in DC, I'll go through it, but worked its way up here. So if you were around this region at that time, you might remember it. But to this day, we still don't know the cause of the event, but I'm going to run you through some of the steps we took and the research that came from it. So before I dive into all of that, I just wanted to give an introduction to the Wildlife Futures Programme, both where Brock and myself work. So the program started back in 2019 as a partnership between the Pennsylvania Game Commission to address the growing needs across wildlife health. So our mission is to discover innovative and proactive solutions to a variety of complex health challenges. And we aim to be collaborative, supportive, and inclusive. And that means not only within our team, but outside our team, and particularly to the next generation of wildlife professionals, but also empowering our stakeholders to make educated management decisions. So to help accomplish this, we've got 5 major areas of focus. Probably the 2 most relevant to the presentation I'm going to give today is our preparedness and monitoring. So looking at how we can prepare and how to best respond to mortality or morbidity events, but also research. And so that could be research answering a direct research question, or it could be in response to an event like this. So this slide is a lot of words, but it's really just to highlight that even though I'm giving the presentation today, there was a huge team behind this response spanning across multiple states, particularly the wildlife rehabilitators and the general public played a huge role, particularly early on in the response. But we've also got other research institutes, universities, veterinary diagnostic labs, state agencies, federal agencies. They all played a part in this. So we're just sort of one piece of the puzzle. Okay, so what actually happened during this event? So it started in about late May of 2021, when we started receiving reports of sick and dead songbirds or passerines, mainly focused around the DC region. So these birds were being reported to wildlife rehabbers, either brought in with clinical signs or found dead on the street by the members of the public. So the majority of these birds were nestlings or fledglings across 4 different species. So they're listed there: the American robin, the European starling, the blue jay, and the common grackle. And it was more often that these birds were found as single birds, so alone, not in sort of big groupings. And like I said, they were either found dead or the majority of the time euthanized by the rehabbers because it was such a late stage of disease. So within a short time frame, reports started coming from a broader geographical region, and this was in weeks, and this ranged all the way as far north as New Hampshire, but also we were getting reports as far south as Florida. And one thing to keep in mind when we start getting these reports is that we can never be sure if this is evidence of spread or whether it's people just becoming more aware of the event, and people that wouldn't usually go out and look for birds are finding a dead bird and reporting it, and we're sort of making a connection there that shouldn't be there. So what were we seeing with these birds? And I apologize if anyone doesn't want to see these gross images. So the most obvious clinical sign were these bulging or swelling of the eyes or the eyelids. And more often than not, it had like a crusty discharge. And if we looked, so this was sort of a gross pathology if you just looked at the bird, but then if we went and did histopathology, we could see a lot of sort of secondary damage. So that we could see corneal ulcers, We could see an inflammation of a lot of the ocular structures, particularly internal. So there was inflammation of like the iris. There was hemorrhaging, which we weren't sure if that was secondary to what was happening, or whether it was like these birds were flying into windows, or any sort of traumatic injury, because they were unlikely to have full vision at this point. And we could also see secondary sort of bacterial infections, particularly across the eye region. But then other than the eyes, really most of the birds lacked any sort of non-ocular lesions. So if when we did necropsy, there wasn't really anything else abnormal with these birds. A lot of them were still in fairly good body condition as well. And so that really led to some more diagnostics. A lot of the birds, I'm sorry if the video is a bit funky over Zoom, also presented with neurological signs. So this was less commonly reported than the eye swelling, but some of them who made it to rehabbers showed these signs of ataxia, head tilts, nystagmus, so that involuntary eye movement. And this is a juvenile blue jay that was actually picked up in Florida, particularly showing that sort of lack of coordination, stammering around, not really aware of their surroundings. So, like I said, many of these birds found their way into wildlife rehabilitators who play. Sorry, slide change. Don't know why that's stuck. Trying to do something fancy and put a video in.
What's that? Video must be.
Yeah, it's not showing what's on my.
Oh. Maybe try hitting back once.
I'm sharing too.
And then
This is more fruitful.
no.
I'll stop sharing. We'll see if that works. Okay, sorry about that, folks. Okay, so okay, sorry. Trouble with my slide advancing. So really, I just wanted to highlight the huge role of the rehabilitators and the general public in this response. They are really at the front line of some of these responses, particularly when it comes with interactions with the public. And they were the people that really alerted the state officials who could launch more of a formal investigation. And so from then on, once we sort of had an investigation up and running, the rehabbers also then helped us with a lot of the sample collection, but they also were there to try various different treatments on the birds that they had in their care. Unfortunately, a lot of them were unsuccessful. I think the one treatment that ended up showed a little bit of success was a treatment with vitamin A, and I'll go into some theories behind that later on, but it was really hit or miss with it. Awesome. And so not surprisingly, the media also then started reporting on this event, and the coverage was huge across sort of your traditional media platforms, but also social media. And if you heard of it, then this is probably where it came from, some sort of media report. And this kind of potentially added fuel to the fire when it came to reporting of these sick and dead birds to us. And a lot of them we were unsure were actual real cases or not, or whether it was just kind of what I was talking about, this sort of self-inflation of people going out there and just reporting birds that would usually be dead anyway. So that's kind of adding to the confusion when we're trying to do diagnostics on these birds. In response, some state agencies did develop online reporting systems to help handle this sort of increase in volume. So, for example, in PA, we did just an online reporting platform, and we got reports from all of our counties, plus 35 other states, plus reports from other countries. So we had people from India and Canada reporting on sick and dead birds, and we had to follow up with all of these people to get some sort of gauge on whether these reports were part of this outbreak or whether they were something different. But this is kind of just to give you some idea of what's going on behind the scenes of this event. A lot of our personnel got roped into this. And even if it wasn't looking at reports of dead and dying birds, we were fielding questions. There was a lot of theories going around from the general public. Some of them I've listed here, some of them were wild, robotics gone awry, and sort of taking on a role of sort of public education and outreach as this event unfolded. So that's kind of a bit of a behind the scenes. This is more once sort of we got the idea of the sort of scope and scale of this event, we then went to do a coordinated response. So this was a response involving the state agencies and diagnostic labs across multiple different states. And there was multiple reasons for this. So one was that, instead of labs working in isolation and, running all the same tests, we could split samples, we could share data, and, put our heads together and try to figure this out as a team. But also it was to try to come up with some consistent messaging to the public, particularly around bird feeders. So there was a lot of questions about what people should do with their bird feeders. And the general recommendation, I think in the end, was wash it with 10% bleach and air dry it. And this was under the assumption that it was an infectious agent and this could potentially help reduce the spread. But some states still recommended the complete removal of feeders. So even with a coordinated response, there was different messaging out there. And from the general public point of view, it can get confusing. But attempts were made to do a collaborative approach. And I've just highlighted on that map there all the different veterinary diagnostic labs, including Paddle's New Bolden Center there in Pennsylvania. That's where we're based out of, who contributed data and testing towards these samples. So what tests were actually run? So we did multiple diagnostic tests. However, like I said, they didn't actually end up revealing any clear cause of the mortality event. So I've listed some of the tests out here, but most of them were inconclusive. So the first lists are of important pathogens that were kind of ruled out more than anything else. So you can see kind of some of the big culprits there that we might suspect: West Nile virus, mycoplasma, avian influenza virus, pox viruses. They were all tested for, all ruled out. We also tested for a lot of toxic agents. So we've got insecticides, pesticides, and a lot of the birds did have some residuals, but nothing that was, I put here, questionably significant. Most birds that go through our lab, if we test, have some sort of residuals for insecticides. We also tested for heavy metals, and apart from high iron levels, there again wasn't really anything abnormal. The high iron levels quite often happens in result from starvation. So the likelihood is that these birds couldn't see and probably couldn't forest or exhibit their natural behaviours, feeding behaviours, and that contributed to their demise. So another avenue that we ended up pursuing at the time were testing cicadas. And the theory behind this was that around about the same time, late May, early June, there was portions of the outbreak area that also saw this emergence of periodical cicadas. So this brood in particular belonged to the 17-year brood. And out in the field, we saw birds feasting on these cicadas in their, hundreds. We would go visit nests, and the cicadas were all over the nests. And so that led to some, theories that they might be contributing either to the spread or the cause. We were wondering if there might be a link between the cicadas and the birds. And so these cicadas spend most of their life underground, where they may accumulate the pesticides and other contaminants. So that was one of the reasons we tested the birds as well. But given that the birds, we didn't find significant levels, we ruled that out. We also suspected that a type of fungus, so it's called Massospora, it infects the cicadas, but we thought this might also play a role. But when we tested the birds, there was no evidence of this fungus. And so that really left us to wonder what is happening. Is there a real link? And to this date, I think most people believe that the cicadas are still blameless. There are some experts that say that the birds tend to avoid eating the fungus-ridden cicadas, so that might be why we didn't see any birds with high levels of the fungus. But we were also getting birds reported in areas where the cicadas were not found. So next, this was a last kind of effort in like what to do next. We keep coming up with these non-significant findings. And so what we did was a metagenomic analysis. So this is a more of a non-traditional technique. But for those of you that might not have heard of it, it's culture independent. So it's a sequencing technique that allows you to use nucleic acid recovered from different sample types. And it can be used to detect most, if not all, microorganisms in a clinical sample. So we don't need any prior knowledge of what might be in there. So for example, if you're running a PCR, you need to know what you're looking for, like what you're hoping to find to run the right PCR in most cases. But with this technique, you don't need to have an idea of what you're looking for, because it will find most of the things in the sample. So the issue with this is that it is like looking for a needle in a haystack. So a lot of data is generated, and you have to take care in interpreting the results. So this did end up in a paper. If you want to go more into depth about it, I'm going to give a quick overview of what we found. This shows you from where all the birds came for that metagenomic analysis. So this is just a subset of the birds. So you can see the different species down there. So we had the American robin, the blue jay, the grackle, but we also had northern cardinals and northern mockingbirds in there. The other, there was everything from, I think there was a Cooper hawk in there. There was a lot of different, there was a couple of raptors, but they were only in very small numbers. So it was one bird. I think there was like one Cooper's hawk, for example. But it got included in this analysis. It was across 13 different states, and the samples included the eye, the brain, the lung, the bursa, and the heart blood. So in total, this is, like I said, sort of a big picture overview of what we found. This graph shows the number of taxa detected across each tissue type. So the colors represent the sample type. So for example, in blue there, you've got the eye and the brain, and then you've just got the taxa that was detected. So you can see the most frequently detected taxa was bacterial. That's not uncommon. And it was found in relatively similar numbers or the same number of hits across the different sample types. The exception here is the eukaryotics that are in the eye and the brain. And this was because of, we think, contamination. So the eye and the brain, or not the brain, the eye in particular was very hard to sample. We were finding plant matter, for example, in the eye. And that's just because, these birds are on the ground for a long time. And they have all sorts of things, in their eye that we can find through metagenomic sequencing, but it's not of interest to us for this analysis. So the important thing to see when you're looking at this is that they weren't all pathogenic. I'm not talking, we have commensal organisms that would also be found in this, but it is mainly bacterial. So if I was to look at the pathogenic microbes that we found, I've just listed the top ones in each of those groups, the bacterial, the eukaryotic, and the viral. But many of these birds many of these pathogens that were found were actually found across the healthy birds and the sick birds. And this is because a lot of these are unsurprisingly sort of secondary infections that could happen once the bird has been found dead, or a commensal, or opportunistic, I should say, and are around and won't cause an infection until that bird shows signs of illness. So we don't think any of these are the root cause for several reasons, not only because they were found across the healthy birds and the sick birds, but also because a lot of the time the clinical signs didn't match what we knew of these pathogens. And so that really comes down to maybe these birds were included in the event when they shouldn't have been. Okay, so this is really just a summary to kind of say that we still don't know what's going on. And there have been reports since and other studies looking at various different behavioral traits of these birds, nesting traits, migration patterns, all sorts. And there's still no firm hypothesis. And so some of us were sitting there in 2022 wondering if it was going to happen again. It didn't. And it hasn't happened subsequently. So really it's a bit of a burst of the bubble, but it's still a mystery. But we did learn a lot from this event, and I think it's really important to kind of keep these in mind, particularly when we look at preparedness and response to other not only mortality events in birds but in wildlife. We always jump to the pathogens, particularly I'm an epidemiologist, so I love my diseases, but it may not always be pathogenic in origin, particularly in this sort of changing world where we've got a lot of toxins, a lot of environmental contaminants. It's really important to keep those in mind when we start getting these events, but also important to keep in mind if you are handling birds. And then just the really important role of the wildlife rehabilitators and citizens. Like quite often they are overlooked when we are writing up like sort of response plans, but really they are at the front lines and need to be involved a lot earlier in sort of the planning stage of sort of when we're looking at disease responses. And also just increasing capacity within our wildlife diagnostic services. So a lot of the time within a state, there may only be one veterinary lab. And so when they are inundated with animals, the only way that they're able to sort of increase that capacity is by having these coordinated responses. And so we are looking at ways of sort of boosting that capacity, not only within Pennsylvania, but with neighboring states. So with that, I'll take any questions.
This has not reoccurred, which is good. Is there any historical data that had ever occurred before? Because I know that that would be soft data, but is this a complete one-off event?
Yeah, so we tried looking at that. And particularly that was kind of my role when I first entered my position. I kind of got given this as a research topic, and there wasn't anything that I could find. Some of that is down to the fact that events like this aren't recorded, even like scientifically. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to publish on it. Like, if people don't have any findings, people don't want to publish. But it's really important to keep a record of these events. So I couldn't find anything historically. There was a lot to do with like mycoplasma. That's kind of the pathogen that people go to when they think of ocular diseases in birds. But nothing at this scale or particularly in some of these species, there was nothing found.
Can you comment? By the way, this is absolutely fascinating, and it's really a privilege to hear from you guys. I hope people appreciate, I mean, the extraordinary network that has backed this research up. Just absolutely remarkable and so important now with the issue of, avian-borne viruses and possible transmission to humans and all of that. So we really appreciate your doing this. Can you comment on the case definition? So was the case definition the eye disease plus the neurological? Did all of the samples in your N, your number, require both of those?
So the case definition changed very early on in the event. So the neurological disease wasn't as common as the ocular disease. So it got added a little bit later. And for those of you who might not be aware of case definition, so in a response, quite often the first thing we do is try to define what we're seeing. So when we are presented with another potential case, we can say, well, does this match the case definition? And if it doesn't, how confident can we be that it's actually a part of this event? And the neurological signs came a lot later. We were hesitant to add it at first, just because at the time as well, HPAI was still coming and going, and so that that's also associated with neurological signs. But when we managed to rule that out, it became very clear that the two were linked. And so yes, they were both in the case definition, in the final case definition. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Yep. And also, I just want to mention, people may not know things like PCR terms. So if people in the audience have questions about terminology, don't hesitate. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this maybe it won't help.
We could come back and give a whole other talk on PCR. Yeah.
Yes, not only was this event unusual, but your publication on it is very unusual.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, basically your publication is something happened and we can't figure it out.
Yeah.
It's very unusual in science to be able to publish something like that. When something happens and you can't figure it out, it's not going to get published. People usually don't even write it up.
Exactly.
But that means that there's a lot missing from the scientific record.
Yeah.
So that people can run into other events they don't have the benefit of that.
That's exactly it. And we went to other sources. So we went to, once the scientific literature was, we realized we weren't getting anything historically from that. We also asked wildlife rehabilitators if they've, historically seen anything in this, like state veterinarians, state biologists, because again, they don't usually record this stuff. And there's that sort of sparked the question of this loss of knowledge, particularly, as people retire or as people move on to different careers or whatever. that knowledge goes with them. And so really, like, we wanted to publish on this for that reason, to kind of put that into the record book. So if this happens again in 50 years' time, someone might be able to see what we did and improve on it.
So, yeah, I want to go back to the biology. I'm just wrestling, right? I'm sure this keeps you up at night. But so the four species, there's nothing that jumps out at me that links them biologically other than sort of medium body size, and they're all abundant. But there are lots of medium body size abundant birds out there. Do you have any thoughts, or did anyone have any thoughts of why it might be that set of four species that seem to be so heavily impacted?
Yeah, so there was another analysis done on that, looking at traits, in particular, like behavioral traits, feeding traits, stuff like that. The birds that were being collected were somewhat biased in the fact that a lot of them are sort of ones you find at your backyard feeder birds, or they're in cities where people are like walking and are out and about. And so that hugely biases your sample. We're finding birds where the people are finding them. And so there could have been other birds affected by it, and we just didn't, they were being eaten by scavengers, and just not found, or they were out, somewhere remote and we didn't find them. So that's one possibility. Yeah, there was nothing conclusive from the trait analysis either. Ground foraging, I think, came up as potentially important, but then there's heaps of other ground foraging passerines that weren't affected. So I think the only thing that is still left to do is potentially immunological work, looking at sort of their like different immune systems, but that's considering a lot of these birds, the birds that were in freezers and the samples, we haven't got a lot of it left. Those questions are really hard to pick apart.
What was your total mortality? How many birds did you actually spend like in this condition?
In total, I don't think I have a number on the top of my head from across the different states. Sample-wise, like the birds that we had in hand to get samples off, we had, I think, about 250. But that was only the ones that we got for diagnostic testing. So the ones that went to rehabbers that, got euthanized and just disposed of, or the ones that were reported dead on the ground and nothing got done with them, those birds aren't included in that count. And considering that a lot were sort of found dead on site, that's probably a huge underestimation.
You can't extrapolate a number, just guesswork, or
I would hate to extrapolate a number. I mean, at Pennsylvania alone, I know we had, I think it was 100 plus birds reported in a very kind of small geographical area. We're talking just about the sort of southeast region of Pennsylvania. But I imagine DC is a lot more. It's a lot more than that.
I didn't see any house sparrows mentioned. Did you have a lot of house sparrows? Just because I know how common they are.
Yeah, we did have some. From what I remember, I should have brought the Excel spreadsheet that we have. There was definitely some sparrows on there, but in proportion to how like common they are, not nearly enough. We would expect to see a lot more.
how about house finches, which often get kind of conjunctivitis?
Yeah. Off the top of my head, I don't remember finches being on the list. I'm happy to take any more questions. I do want to leave time for Brock.
May I ask you just quickly? Of course, I'm sitting here thinking, my God, this is amazing. And I'm also thinking that about the federal cutbacks in grants and funding by this, fascist regime. Has that affected, in a nutshell, that the wildlife futures and you know, need we worry about that? God.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely impacted funding on a whole at a federal and a state level. I don't think it's anything immediate to worry about. So we've still got processes in place that are looking at sort of expanding our preparedness and response plans. And that works very closely with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. I think
That's
the
good.
long-term impacts in general is hard to say.
Right.
But
Well, thank you. Keep up the great work. Thanks so much.
thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you.
Thank you.